Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're going to have an incredible episode, just like always. So, we've got a few topics to discuss here before we jump into the cognitive elite questions. So, I've got the first topic I'm going to discuss. I'm going to try to keep these brief. As I always say that, I keep these brief, and watch me go on a 30-minute dialogue about this. A 30-minute monologue. No dialogue going on here. I'm just talking with myself. So the first topic we're going to talk about is Elon Musk's response to the Great Replacement theory. He says there is sort of a great replacement, but the real problem isn't quite immigration, it's low birth rates. He said this in response to Ava Vlardingerbroek. I'm going to say that's how the best way of pronouncing it, Vlardingerbroek. Of course, most people just call her Ava Vlar, as her handles implies. And she was at CPAC Hungary saying that the Great Replacement is real. And I think she even gave an interview about worrying about the extinction of white people and indigenous white people in Europe. And Elon responded with his own theory, his own take on the Great Replacement theory. He said the problem with Great Replacement theory is that it fails to address the foundational issue of low birth rates. Record low birth rates are leading to population collapse in Europe and even faster population collapse in most of Asia. Immigration is low in Asia, so there is no replacement going on. The countries are simply shrinking away. If this doesn't turn around, then any countries on Earth with low birth rates will become empty of people and fall into ruin, like the remains we see of the many long dead civilizations. So this is Elon going off. He's at times said that there's a great replacement. Other times he's, I guess, has his own take on this. So there's a few things to break down from this. One, this is a common theme when people ever talk about the great replacement, is that they're like, well, if you want to end it, how about you have kids? Which obviously everyone should have kids if they have the capacity to have so and have some good genes to pass on to the next generation. I'm not one of those people that saying that you shouldn't have kids. I don't think there is anyone actually saying that, but it's a straw man built up to counter any positions that would say that, you know, we're not going to reproduce our way out of this, or there's other acts that we have to do, and that reproduction and family formation are not political acts in themselves. When you suggest this, people get really mad. But it's always very common for someone to say that in response to any concerns you have about immigration or white, replacement in their own countries. Anytime Wilfred Riley, who's this black or mixed race, he's black anyway, writer, researcher, who is, anytime he gets up this, he's always like, hey, whites, how about you just have kids? And Richard Hanani always makes this case. People have always been making this case, is like, if you're worried about so few whites, why don't you have kids? And Elon has a nicer way of saying that. I think a less troll or wanting to, poke somebody in the eye about this take with his own. But it's ultimately stupid, because what it's suggesting by the take is that saying immigration isn't the real problem. What's the real problem is a personal matter. And that if you're so worried about the great replacement, you can just have kids, and that's the real answer to this. It's that, immigration's not the real issue. Look at Asia. They're having no immigration, yet they're having population replacement there. Yet they're, investing much more in technology to ensure that they don't need low-skilled workers as much as America and Europe do. So they're able to work around it, and also they have a stronger sense of themselves as a people, of who they are, whether they're Korean, Japanese, these various whatever people that they want to describe to, and thus they don't want to dilute that identity by having foreigners in there, and they're able to much more capable of emphasizing this than a lot of other Westerners, Europeans as well. I was about to say Europeans, but it's Westerners in general. And so they're able to emphasize that, and they would rather take economic affects the economy in a way that, to preserve their identity, which a lot of Westerners are not. Especially Americans, everything's about the economy. business is at the heart of America. So all these people are like, oh, we can't. We'll have some minor ill effects on our economics if we don't have mass immigration. So we need to have it, which obviously long term would be better for the economy, but that's another subject. And so Asia is having this problem. But Asia is not like they're, oh, we're not going to do anything about our birth rates. Asian countries have some of the best for natalist policies in the world in terms of trying to boost the birth rate. Like even compared to America, like they have ridiculously generous maternity leave policies. They have a lot of tax subsidies for people to have kids. They even believe this is Taiwan. In Taiwan, the government even sets up singles events to encourage people to mix and mingle and then set off and get married. And they're obsessed with this. They're really all these countries like Korea, Japan, Taiwan, a few others are all trying to work on this problem. Probably much more aggressively than especially America. I mean, America, there's no real family planning policy. Yet we have pretty higher birth rate than a lot of the rest of the industrialized world. I mean, it's no longer. I mean, not as high as it once was, but it's in comparison to Eastern Europe and Asia, it's better, but it's slipping off. And they're trying the best they can to improve the birth rate, but they can't get it up. In multiple ways, I would say, but they can't get it to increase. And this is, when you want to say that this is just a personal problem, it forgets the larger social transformations that have been happening in our society that are leading to lower birth rates. And what's happening is we now have all of our young women going to college, entering the workforce, and wanting to have a career, and then sometime in their 30s, they're going to have children. When you have that as the norm, you're going to have fewer children, because the way you had a lot of kids is that you had, and this would even been for the husband as well, is that the men and women would marry right after high school, in their late teens, early 20s. They'd be running a farm or something of that sort, and they would be pumping out kids for a while, and that would be the norm for our society. And the kids would be necessary to work on the farm, help the father with the farm, or help with household chores with the mother. And it's not so much that the wife working was doing a lot of work at the house. I mean, it wasn't quite like she didn't have a job. It wasn't in the way of the 50s, 60s, the wife is a stay-at-home mom and watching soap operas all day. Like, they were working a lot too. And that was the whole, is home-based economy. And now that's like completely different. These women are not marrying off at 20 and then having all these kids throughout their 20s and early 30s. They're now at 31, maybe finally getting married if they are there. And then you expect them to have 4 kids while they still have like a professional job and they're living in a city or some sort, and they don't even have the space. And also the kids themselves are not quite the they're not workers anymore. You don't really need them to work on your suburban home of some sort. They're just there to have children. And so it's the completely different economic model and social model we have. And this is largely based on what women's choices are. Even in the 50s and 60s, college was overwhelmingly male. People were marrying younger. Women expected to be, their job would be in the household. And men were able to make enough money on one income to support a family. That's no longer the case. And even when it comes to one income, women are starting to exceed men, because it's like 60% of college graduates or people in college are female. 40% are male. There might be some other genders there too in the mix. But men are falling behind. And generally and even this is true in post-grad, most post-grad programs are overwhelmingly female. Law school is now overwhelmingly female. So most of the people going into careers in America, and this is true throughout the West, but particularly in America, are women. And they're not going to just say at 25, like, oh, well, I guess I'm going to have children after law school, and I'm going to let my husband hopefully support the entire family. There are a few exceptional cases to this. I mean, Amy Coney Barrett and some others. Well, those are exceptional cases. The norm is that eventually at some point in their 30s, they have one or two kids. And that's just how the economic format works. And even at a lower scale, I mean, not everyone's going into, post grad, graduate school and those matters, but even just like going into college, standard woman going to work some minor white collar job, I guess in Atlanta or whatever, they're still going to be waiting till the late 20s or early 30s to marry and have kids. And generally, when they're going to marry and have kids, they're going to only have one or two, and they're still going to be working because their husband can't support the family on a single income for the most part. So all these matters just indicate that you are not going to boost the birth rates unless there is a major cultural, economic, and social transformation in the country that allows people to continue to boost or have a ton of kids. And we don't even have a real cultural impetus to have kids because it's all just a personal matter of whether you're fulfilling personal happiness or not. And in our society, we are a largely atomized society where people don't face as much social pressures to have children. And even with women, most of their narrative that they're receiving from when they're young and into college is that you need to have a career and you need to live it up. This is the dream. And without kids, you can have endless brunch and tons of vacations and do whatever you want. And, this is the great life that was promised in TV shows. And then at some point, maybe you can marry if you want to. There's no really higher cause you are serving by having children. It's just something that you may want to do as personal self-fulfillment after having your career or still having a career. And this is affecting both Asia. I mean, it's women's choice, and it's the same in Korea where all these women are now taking up careers and they're working 70, 80 hours a week. It's insane the amount of hours they're working in East Asia. They don't have time for kids, and there's a real gender war going on in Korea, in South Korea. South Korea, when we're saying Korea, we're saying South Korea. North Korea is a little bit different, obviously. So they're having those issues, and this is similar to what we're seeing in America. And so it's not, when you say just have kids, people aren't going to listen on Twitter. And, Elon's having kids, but it's a very bizarre manner, and, he's the world's wealthiest man, and he's having children with multiple women, and there's a lot of strange things happening with that, and I don't think most people can follow that model with, having multiple kids with Grimes and other subordinates and all these things. But he is, good for him that he's having all these kids. But even in that case with, some of the kids you have, they may not end up giving you grandkids or ending up the way you want. I believe his oldest son became a she. So, that can also happen as long as the left dominates the culture. And some people always say, well, the right will outproduce the left. The thing is, the left can always recruit the kids from the right. There's tons of stories of homeschool kids who go off and do other things. As there's so many choices, unlimited choice in America, and some people, they can come from an evangelical homeschool family, and then they end up having an OnlyFans or going off to be a twink in San Francisco, which is like this. I always bring up this one conservative congressman who did that, who homeschooled both his kids, and his daughter ended up having an OnlyFans, and his son ended up being a twink in San Francisco. So not a high success rate there. But that's not all cases, but that can still happen. So sometimes you may think that, but then the left will recruit your kids no matter what because they control the culture. Well, that's a separate matter. All I'm saying is that you, as a large society, even just having these messages of just saying we need to boost the birth rate and all this, it's not really reaching the people because several people on the right have this message, but they're still not having kids or having as many kids as you want them to have. And simply telling people to have kids doesn't overlook the fact that we have this factor of women's choice that is, wasn't as present in years past when there was a higher birth rate, and now it is, and none of these women want to give it up, and none of them want to give up the ambitions and career and dreams that they've been told to have by society itself. And this leads to a lot of the birth woes we're having in America right now and throughout the world. It's even low fertility rates, declining fertility rates are even happening in the third world as well, which is actually a good thing. But there are other problems that the fertility rate is heading towards below one in the West as well. So it's very difficult to boost the birth rate, but you can have government policies to restrict immigration, and then you could figure out ways to have a society that's still functional with fewer people or not as many kids. AI and other technological advances can help us there. Because as a society, it's easier to deal with immigration, and also with immigration, you fundamentally change the population. So maybe years down the line, maybe you have a huge birth rate, but at the same time, you still have all these people here who are radically transforming the country, or they're the ones who are responsible for the huge birth rate, and thus you change your country and you replace the population. And that's all about the Great Replacement. And also, what he says about the Great Replacement is that low fertility rates is an inherent part of the theory. But it's harder to boost the fertility rate compared to immigration. And so you have to focus on the problem at hand. And you can always, reverse fertility rates at some point, or birth rates. You can always figure out a way that eventually you get a higher fertility rate. But once you bring those other people here, then your country's completely different, and the problem becomes much harder to solve. And that's something that you have to realize with a Great Replacement. So whenever they say this stuff about just having kids, it's more about disengaging people from real political problems and then just turning everything into a personal matter. Which I always find this with the right, is that everything, if you just want to rebel, have a family. And it's like not an act of rebellion, because our society still has benefits for families, just not enough. And it's not like, the FBI is going to knock down your door for having a second kid. That doesn't happen, but a lot of people want to imagine that's what happens. But even though that didn't even happen to them, it's not a political act. And really, what it is, it's for these people who don't care about these issues, who don't care that whites are becoming a minority and that this country's going to be the brownification of America. They simply just want to own people and dunk on them and saying, well, how about you just have more kids? And the fact is, we're not going to have more kids. But we can restrict immigration, and we can focus on immigration and those matters to ensure that we're not fully replaced in our own countries, and that we can figure out ways to solve these problems that we have before us and the demographic problems without introducing a foreign element that radically transforms the country we are. And that if you have all those foreigners here and migrants, you then have a country that is no longer yours. And so that's a bigger problem than anything else, and that is the problem we can resolve. An Elon Musk tweet is not going to change people's minds, and particularly women. And it's all really the fertility crisis. I mean, it is economic changes that leads men to not have as much money as before, or not succeeding in the economy as much as before. But the real issue is women's choice now being a major factor in our societies, when we didn't have this as a factor 50, 100 years ago. And now we're struggling to work around it, and it's leading to fewer kids. And the fact is, a lot of these conservative women who are all into this stuff, like we need more kids and stuff, they're living out the same lifestyle as their liberal peers, as I always point out this. And, they don't even want to give up their career in, having a Heritage Foundation staff position of some sort. So even the women listening to this aren't even following that program. But I mean, it's not like they may not have the good men scarcity may mean that they can't find a man to wife them up. But that's another matter. But I just always, whenever I see these comments, I think Elon's saying it in better faith than a lot of other people, but usually it's done to tell people who care about these matters to stop caring about it. Just focus on your own life and what you can solve. And then eventually you continue to see these worse trends get worse and worse and worse. And then you're just like, well, you had kids. There you go. The Great Replacement is done. And then you see all the kids at the other kids at your kid's school, and you realize that having kids is not actually going to solve this problem. So that is my take on that. Now we're going to move on to the campus protests going on all across America, going on at Columbia, George Washington University, a bunch of schools in Southern California. They've tried it at UT Austin and elsewhere. And going off on this matter because it's become a very important story. I have to say this is generally campus kids do this stuff all stupid all the time. And it is they're obviously protesting the war and protesting Israel. I don't know if taking over the quad of their campus is going to end the war against Israel. It does represent how young people in America are turning against Israel. There was a new poll showing view of the war and how Israel is conducting it, and over 80% of people 18 to 29, I think it's 18 to 29, might have been 18 to 24, disapprove of the way Israel is conducting the war. Which a lot of people probably don't know that much about the war, but what little they do know, they disapprove of. And you do have these major protests at many major schools. And were more attempts to try to do this, but they've all threatened that all these kids would get arrested simply for having a tent on the on campus grounds. These kids aren't really doing anything besides just parking themselves, and there's not really an element of violence here. Hanania, I criticized Hanania before, but he did have a pretty decent article on these things saying that young people are too gay to rebel, and he was pointing out how he didn't make the most important point. And this also goes back to my last, is that saying, colleges are overwhelmingly female. These protests have to be at least 70% female, if not 80% female. And then the men that are there are all gay. It's now you could still have sympathy for the cause of how they're, criticizing Israel, but at the same time, you're looking at these people and you're like, I don't find myself fitting in with these people, but they are not threatening whatsoever. There's even this gay black guy who goes by he, she, they, that's his pronouns. And he was calling for killing all Zionists or something, or threats to Zionists. And he's doing it in he's like, we got to do this. And you're just like, I don't think there's any meat behind this threat. And it's the same with all these students. It's these are the least threatening people in America. But according to a lot of pro-Israel people, including a lot of Republicans, they're having pogroms on campuses, which the only level of violence they've found is that there was one kid waving a Palestinian flag in front of some type of pro-Israel person. Because all these things are they're getting, I got shot in the face, is that there's a bunch of guys going in there with a Israeli flag draped around them and then shouting that you are anti-Semites, and then somebody argues with them. And there was some guy doing that, taking camera of the students, and some guy accidentally waved a Palestinian flag in another dude's eye. And it hit his eye. I think it was minor damage. I don't think there was real damage. It was just he got poked in the eye accidentally. And it was accidental too. This has to be made clear. It's accidental. If you watch the video, it's the guy's pushing his camera in front of these kids, and somebody with a flag it goes around his hand and hits him in the eye. And this is the level of violence that we're seeing, which all these people are saying about how these are pogroms going on. And they're just such ridiculous matters. And none of these people are getting assaulted or anything. They're just getting yelled at or having arguments. And they're, and they're trying to provoke these people too. But sometimes I don't even get provoked. There was some really funny video of this woman who has a shirt written with Jew on it. And she goes in the middle and she has a very serious look on her face. And she's like, I will not back down from these people. And then all the crowd around her just ignores her. And you're like, well, this is some type of pogrom if that's happening. So the element of what's happening, the response to it is far dumber than the kids involved in this stuff. Because the thing you have to realize is a lot of people are lamenting that the right is excited about police going in and arresting these people and shoving them and throwing them down. And you have to realize is because a lot of politics is who you see as friend and enemy. Obviously for Schmidt. And pretty much every right winger is going to look at the people who are protesting, and even maybe they might even have sympathy for their cause, but they're going to immediately look at these people and they're like, people with gender pronouns, have purple hair, septum piercing, and they're obviously just not going to side with them. And they're going to look at the police, and it's some big white guy looks like he played offensive line back in college. They're obviously going to side with the police, and they like these stuff, seeing these police officers do this stuff. Now, in Southern California, it was all black cops, but for some reason, I don't know. I guess that's who they hire for campus police at these universities. But in Austin, it was like all these gigantic white guys who were the ones like, arresting them and pushing them through. And the right is cheering that on because they view these Zoomers as the enemy. And this even goes back to the Nikolai Muse story that I talked about with the Apple River stabbings, where that guy stabbed those Zoomers who were in a fight with him. Unlike this case, or unlike that case where the Zoomers are like the good Zoomers. I mean, they're all largely white. They're like jocks. They didn't have purple hair and stuff, and they're not, septum piercings, and they think pronouns are gay. The ones that are at campus are the really left-wing Zoomers. But conservatives in general just hate Zoomers, and any type of violence towards them, they're gonna support, especially if they're openly leftist. And so the chief animating the motivation of the right, or the unifying political ideal or goal, is own the libs. And they see these guys as libs regardless of their cause, and they see white police officers busting heads and arresting them, and they're all like, yes, we love this. To add to more of that fervor in favor of cracking down on them, they're all Zoomers, they're all young people, and all the Gen Xers and Boomers love this. I don't think the majority of conservatives who are cheering this on really care that much, or care that it's Israel. I mean, they would just support this no matter what. And, you could tell them, wouldn't it have been better if they'd done this for Black Lives Matter or something like that, where they were actually violent or actually causing destruction? They might be convinced of that, but they're like, well, it doesn't matter. As long as they're still getting owned, I'm supporting it. And it's very hard to tell these people that you should be on the side with the protesters, even if they are critical of Israel. I think even people who are critical of Israel have had a tough time to support the protesters, because they look at them and they're like, I don't want to have anything to do with these people. And in some argument, they aren't very productive for encouraging the right to become more anti-Israel. Because when people are put in this position of which groups they're going to identify with, if they view the only people who are anti-Israel as these campus protesters, they're more inclined to just be reflexively pro-Israel for a lot of these conservatives. As they're like, I don't want to be on the same team as these guys. And that's often happens with politics, is that people, no matter how good your argument is or how solid the ideas are, they'll then look at who they're going to be associated with in their political position, and then they decide, I don't want to have that political position because of the people who hold it. And so if you're seeing this as who is anti-Israel, who's criticizing the war effort, and they see the worst leftist they can imagine and the campus protests, they're going to be less inclined to be critical of Israel, or wanting to adopt that position. I mean, let's face it, even though there's a ton of right-wing criticism of Israel online, it's not translating into real-world activity, or for the offline right. Because I always point this out, is that every congressman, Republican lawmaker, with the exception of Thomas Massie and to a lesser extent Rand Paul, is saluting Israel at the moment. There's no primary challengers to any of these Republican candidates on the basis of that they are a slave to AIPAC. In fact, there's actually primary challenges to Massie on the basis of his Israel stance, and he may very well lose his primary. And if he loses his primary, that pretty much leaves Republicans with 0 elected lawmakers who are willing to criticize Israel, with the minor exception of Rand Paul, who's much more, I guess you could say, diplomatic about it. And there hasn't been any real right-wingers involved in these protests. I think, one, it's probably smart because if there was any openly right-wing people there, they'd probably get kicked out of their protest. But I think the only one I saw was like I think like Goyim Defense League or one of these groups did like some protests outside of a synagogue, which the ADL and others love. They're like, oh, we need to portray these people as white supremacists, and neo-Nazis, so they love having those type of protests. So it's probably even smart for the anti-Israel side to not be the defining trait, because right when the war started, the ADL and all these groups were trying to like find like any type of white supremacist protest outside of a synagogue or something of the sort, and they found like two. And then they tried to define the protests as all driven by white supremacists and neo-Nazis, which is obviously not the case. I haven't been really able to run with that. But there is no right-wingers involved in these protests whatsoever, right or wrong. But it's something to keep in mind when you're seeing a lot of the online activity. And in the real world, and who's gravitating towards this issue, it's on the left. I mean, this is roiling primaries. This is a huge matter within Democratic offices and Capitol Hill, because all these young Democratic staffers are incredibly anti-Israel. And this is even in the White House or in the Biden's administration. And yet all the older Democrats are still wanting to be pro-Israel. So there's this big generational divide. And it's not really reflecting on the right outside of Twitter debates, which is something more, which is not nothing, because, 2014 and stuff, there wasn't even that debate happening. Now there is a debate happening on the online sphere, and there are more conservative commentators who are willing to criticize Israel or express skepticism for the amount of money we're giving them. But at the same time, all of the movement that is moving against Israel is coming from the left at this moment, as can be seen in the campus protests. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're looking at this. But while I think it's hard to sympathize, well, you can sympathize maybe with their cause, but it's very hard to sympathize with the people themselves for a lot of the right-wingers on the campus protest. I think the response to them is way more ridiculous, and it's backed by power. These people don't have really any power. This is something different from like when I was writing about campus craziness back in the mid-2010s, and it formed my book, Camps for White Men, is that a lot of that were the people who were able to hold schools hostage, whether it was BLM stuff or gender stuff. They were able to force out, the leadership of a university and institute all these radical changes. Now the university is trying to crack down on these guys in a way that they would have never done towards the BLM protesters back in like 2015, 2016. And so it was more that there was an alliance between the leadership of the university and these protesters, while there's clearly a gap between them, and they're trying much harder to crack down on them. And the response from Republicans is just outrageous, because even if you did disagree with these people, they still have a right to, they're not doing anything. They have a right to protest. Okay, we do have the First Amendment and free speech. And these guys are all trying to say that there's an anti-Semitism exception to the First Amendment, is that we are not going to tolerate anti-Semitism. That's like Greg Abbott's speech, is that saying we are not going to allow anti-Semitism in Texas, and we're going to use all possible means to crack down on this. At the same time, during the BLM riots, he's over there, crying with George Floyd's family and saying this is the worst thing I've ever seen, and we're going to make serious changes to Texas, and he does jack shit about those rioters. Meanwhile, here, these guys aren't really doing it. These goofballs aren't really doing anything. Yet he sends in like gigantic riot cops to push them out and arrest them. And it's, we still want to defend the First Amendment here. And I've always said this with the war in Israel. Our three main things are no American entry into the war, no immigration resulting from the war, and 3, no censorship in response to the war. And unfortunately, we're getting a lot of the censorship angle, and especially from Republicans, who are all like, even though they've worried about safe spaces and cancel culture and all these Jewish students who are demanding a safe space from any criticism of Israel, now Republicans want to send in the Marines to protect them from opinions they don't like, which is more ridiculous than anything that Democrats were doing with the safe space stuff in the mid-2010s. There was no elected lawmaker calling for the Marines and National Guard to be sent in over over white privilege. Now we've got to send in the whole military to protect Jewish students from seeing criticism of Israel. It's safe space on mindset on steroids. So the response to it is just so ridiculous that even I can understand where a lot of right wingers are coming from while supporting, police arresting these people because it's like they see friend enemy there. But at the same time, the justification for it is so ridiculous, is so stupid, and it sets a horrible precedent for anything else. I mean, they could, with this in mind, you could see that maybe black students be like, oh, they're criticizing Black Lives Matter, they're criticizing DEI. We need the military to help protect us. And then Democrats could be calling for that. Maybe if Biden, gets another 4 years, and they'll send in the airborne to protect black students from hearing about criticism of DEI, or there's like a speaker they don't like. That's a very same argument you could make here. So it's like extremely stupid. I don't want to have any sympathy for the ones calling for a crackdown because it's universities. You're going to have people do this stuff all the time. And they're not even violent. They're not capable of violence. The arguments that there's pogroms or whatever is just so absurd. It's not worth taking seriously. And so most of the story is just very stupid all around. But the ones that are more guilty are the people in power, which is not these Palestinian protesters. It's people like Tom Cotton and Josh Hawley and the Greg Abbott who are calling for the military to be used, and for these university administrators and other ones who are wanting to use a strong police presence here. And so I would say that that's the more guilty party of making this idiotic. And this has happened throughout the wars, that a lot of these Zionists and others, they can't help themselves with making it more ridiculous and more over the top with this stuff. I mean, the claims of the over the top atrocities that they're saying is like they were throwing kids into ovens and all this shit. They can't help themselves just to make this more unbelievable. And it's the same with these campus protests where we have all this stuff on video and then they're just like saying they're killing us left and right. And it's like the only incident is the dude with the flag hitting another guy accidentally in the eye. That's it. There's nothing else. And then they've even tried to have these videos like, look at how dangerous this is. And they have like one group of people setting off a flare, one of those like flares that people used to, like the identitarians were big in using the flares in like the mid 2010s. There's like that. And that's like the only level of violence is like, oh, this is so threatening. And there's plenty of incidents of like, even that clip of that ridiculous clip of just that woman just staring there looking stupid with the shirt saying Jew and nothing happens to her. I mean, it's just so absurd. And they just can't help themselves. They have to take up the hysteria up to 11 with this. And I really don't like being manipulated on this. And it's like, I'm not going to support the crackdowns. And so when it's like acting with the crackdowns, I think it is, even though these protesters think I'm an evil racist and should probably be put in a prison camp, I don't think that they should in this scenario, because I think the justification for it is too idiotic to even want to support, and that they could very well use this stuff against the far right as well. And if you start to have these Republican states outlaw anti-Semitism, guess who they're going to go after? They're not going to be going after leftists. They're going to be going after right-wingers. So if anytime you're cheering this on, it's like, oh, this is a huge victory for us to empower left-wing district attorneys to go after local right-wingers for hate speech, you should take a step back and worry about, and not support this. And I've been saying this from time to time, ever since last year when Ron DeSantis was doing this idiotic stuff, which they've actually used that to go after, those Florida laws. They haven't used that to go after Antifa or even these campus protesters. They're using that to go after, Goyim Defense League, which, I mean, they're idiots, but at the same time, they could go after people who are non-idiots. And that's the fact. But, I mean, and you can still have this position and think that campus protests are silly and maybe not worth supporting. And I think there's an optics matter with this. And it's the same if there's people who agree with you and they're having a protest that's so stupid, like horrible optics in other ways, and you won't want to support it. And there's like tons of people, Patriot Front is like protesting great replacement. That doesn't mean you need to support Patriot Front because they're doing it stupidly with the mask and everyone thinks they're feds, and it's counterproductive to your cause for them to adopt this. And I think even with the campus protests, if your main goal is to try to push the right into having a more critical attitude towards Israel, having that cause represented by these campus protesters is maybe not the best thing. So I guess I have a middle way on this, is that I don't really care much about the campus protests. It's just whatever. Compared to what I was covering in my book, this is relatively harmless. They're just camping on campus grounds. It's like, why do I care? I don't really care. It's like a stupid thing. Like university kids do these silly things all the time. The crackdown is, I think, the bigger problem with that, and that all these Republicans just working them up into hysteria over this minor campus fracas. Now, the other thing, the final point I want to say is, how is this going to affect the left? Because now everyone's like, oh, 68, they're going to have another Chicago. And they're referring to the 1968 Chicago riots during this DNC. And so they're all like, oh, this could be another summer of love and other things. I don't really believe that. I think they're going to have protests in the DNC, but it won't rise to the level of 68 because the people involved in the anti-war stuff, and I actually need to make this point because when you're talking about any protest, there's this feeling that if you ever have large degree of protest, that's going to push the public into that direction. But that's not always the case. When the Vietnam War was happening and there was all these mass protests, there was a lot of concern over the Vietnam War, but for a lot of Americans, they absolutely hated the anti-war protesters. And this is why Nixon won in 68, is because people fucking hated those anti-war protesters. And they were almost, in a way, counterproductive to their cause because there's so many male Americans who are like, I hate these long-haired hippies, and I support the police cracking their skulls. And a majority of Americans who were polled on after the 68 DNC riots supported the police cracking their skulls. Like they asked about this, and the majority favored the police response, which that would not happen today. But I think there is something going on when a lot of Americans who see the campus protesters, I don't know how many people are sympathetic towards them. I think some liberals have some sympathy for them, but the entire right doesn't have any sympathy for them. And once that cause is represented by a group that you don't like, as it was happening in the anti-Vietnam War protests, that will change people's opinions on matters or define what they want to, how they view a topic. If they're comparing who's on one side and who's on the other, it's like, well, I don't want to be associated with these people. I have a problem with the war, but I don't want to be associated with these people, so I guess I'll have a mild support for the war. And there was some of that case in the anti-war protests around Vietnam. Now back to the matter at hand. So all the anti-war protests were done by young men. I think most of them are straight. So even though these guys maybe were not the jocks of their time, I mean, a lot of these guys were kind of nerdy. But these were still young men who were capable of violence and capable of fighting police and capable of throwing rocks at the police and stuff. And there were a number, and all these men felt this was personally impacted them because they all felt they could be drafted and sent over to this war they didn't want to fight. So there was a lot of young men who had a lot of energy, had a lot of capacity for violence, not as much capacity as the police officers beating the shit out of them, but they were at least able to fight them. And thus there was able to be more violence. And also you had the Black Panthers around. They weren't really participants in the riots, but they were engaged in a lot of violence. Otherwise, you don't have Black Panthers anymore. I mean, you instead have this gay guy who has he, she, they as his pronouns. That is very different from the Black Panthers, who are all street thugs who had a real capacity for violence. A lot of them were gangbangers and very scary guys. And if they were involved in something, there was bound to be a lot of shit to go down. That even with the white protesters, they did have that. They were capable of rioting. And even in 2020, they were still able to get this because they got local blacks and they got the dregs of society involved with Antifa. And Antifa, as you saw, the guys who Kyle Rittenhouse shot were all petty criminals, long rap sheets, drug addicts who have nothing to lose, so they'll fight people and burn down buildings. Now it's just mostly college students who all have something to lose and are overwhelmingly female. Even with the riots in 2020, there was a large male presence that was capable of doing violence. Now, with these campus protests, if it's all female, there's not going to be shit to go down. That's just human nature. They could get the local Muslims, or maybe Muslims coming in from Detroit or Muslims in Chicago and Illinois, to come and try to start stuff. There hasn't been really that large degree of violence or riotous. I mean, some have been rather aggressive, but not really to the extent of Summer of Love. And you're not going to have a Summer of Love because this is a completely distance from the black community. The black community is not involved in this shit at all. So they're not going to go loot for Palestine. You're not going to have that Summer of Love. And also, Democrats don't want to encourage that because if there are riots, there's always this theme that like Democrats want to encourage riots. It's like, no, they don't. That would hurt them in the election. 2020 was such a bizarre, crazy year that there was a lot going on. I don't think the riots really helped Democrats, but they were able to pin the fact riots were happening on Trump being president and he represented chaos. And the only way we can return to normal is to have Biden. But they were rather awash. But riots helped elect Trump in 2016. If we had riots break out in 2024, this summer, it would help Trump. And I think even these campus protests do help Trump to an extent because both people who are really pro-Israel and really anti-Israel are turning against Biden. And they're either going to, pro-Israel people are going to vote for Trump, or at least some of them. And the anti-Israel people are just not going to vote for all. So as long as these things happen and there's a crackdown on campus protests and that the DNC, there's all these pro-Palestinian protests and they're trying to disrupt things and there's a police crackdown on it, that encourages young people and especially Muslims to not vote for Biden, and that helps Trump. And also this stuff gets associated, and even at the same time, the Democrats are tagged as the pro-Palestinian side, so that also helps Trump. So the more of these protests happen, it is like good for Trump. And as I always say, our larger political goal for this year is to get Trump elected. And so anything that helps Trump get elected is, in some ways, is good. But we're not going to have the riots emanate from this. And even I'm skeptical that you'll have a repeat of 68. You'll have large-scale demonstrations. It's not going to be good for Democrats, but there's not going to be a violent element or as violent of an element that you saw in 68. And also the police are not going to use tactics that they use in 68 to corral these. I mean, they don't need to. I mean, it's like 70% female. They can just like, come here, grab them by the arm and gently put them in a police car. I mean, they don't have to really do much of all. I mean, it's like looking what they did in Austin. They easily push these people around because they're tiny women. But I think in conclusion, the protests do represent this fight that's going on in the left over this issue. And this is the future line of the Democratic Party on what they're going to take on Israel. And I think if Biden loses, the Democrats are going to blame Biden's position on Israel for this. And this is going to make the Democrats gradually more anti-Israel. I think if Biden wins, it dampens it a little bit, but it's still going to be the future of the Democratic Party. It's overwhelming. Their young staffers are overwhelmingly anti-Israel. There's not really constituency outside of Jewish donors who want them to stay pro-Israel, and that's getting pushed out. So this does represent the future of the Democratic Party, and it will be interesting how they handle it for the election and at the convention. And it is going to be embarrassing for the Democrats with it, but I would not bet on large-scale riots on the way that we saw in 68 or 2020. So now moving on to the Cod of the Week questions. We've got a lot of great Cod of the Week questions today. And as a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up at Highly Respected Substack, and that's at highly-respected.com. And make sure to sign up for the IQ supplements while you're there if you haven't already. So I'm going to begin with K-Max today. K-Max asks, Jeremy Carl wrote a book on anti-white racism that became a bestseller on Amazon. His appearance on Tucker Carlson just garnered 50 million views, which Elon Musk tweeted about. In your view, does this confirm the mass appeal of this style is there? As you wrote, mass amounts of white Americans might not identify as white, but will they oppose discrimination against them on the basis of being white? Buying this book or even supporting Stephen Miller's America First Legal to sue companies that discriminate them are steps they will take on a mass scale. There's a few things interesting. One that got 50 million views, but it didn't actually translate into many books, as many book sales as you would imagine, because I wanted to see how's the book doing on Amazon, and it still hadn't cracked into the top 1,000. Now, it was right there. It was like 1,200 or something. But it didn't crack into the top 1,000, which you would imagine that there'd be a lot more people wanting to buy that book if it had, an Elon Musk endorsement. But there's some interesting things aside on the book buying market. When I went on to Tucker Carlson's show promoting my book instantly went into the top 100. And it stayed in the top 1,000 for well over a week due to the Tucker Carlson. And even when I went on like something like Stefan Molyneux, it got it into the top 1,000. It's very tough to get in there. But with the new market, and I think it's with a lot of people, how they interact with tweets, I just think that they would saw the tweet saying, anti-white racism, Tucker's talking about it, and then they don't bother to watch the clip or know what it's about. And they may not have bought the book as many people as would imagine. And also you have to remember is that Twitter has a ton of bots and other things that are inflating views. But with Elon Musk tweets, like pretty much everyone's going to see that. So the more important thing is that Elon Musk was tweeting about it, which is he's been doing a lot, and is like saying this is concerning. And does this convert the mass appeal of the styles there? I think for among Republicans and conservatives, and they do polling on this, is that talking about anti-white racism is very much appealing towards them. Majority of conservatives now view anti-white racism as the most prevalent form of racism and discrimination in this country. Wouldn't have thought that a few years or many years ago, and that would have been considered a laughable idea. Now it's something taken seriously by most conservative commentators, and it's something that even a lot of Republican politicians allude to. And they obviously are going to pose discrimination against them on the basis of being white. Now, does that lead to type of white identitarianism? Not quite. It's mainly that they just don't want to suffer for the color of their skin when it comes to applying to a university or applying for a job. And this stuff is very popular, and you can see that with America First Legal, with them suing companies that discriminate against whites on the basis of the skin color. So even with Elon Musk tweeting that out and getting 50 million views, and it really spreading that, our people are understanding that message, it does show, and even with all the bots and maybe people not fully paying attention towards it, it is a much more mainstream topic than it was even in 2017. If you're talking about anti-white racism among conservatives, they'd be like, they'd look at you and really, what are you talking about? Even when I was promoting my book, there was all these people who were like, why does he have to do the race angle? Like, I don't think it's a race angle. I think it's just anti-conservative. You still see this stuff now, but it's less, it's more undermined. And more people acknowledge that, like, yeah, these people really hate white people. We do have a system in place that is discriminating against white people. And this is what DEI is about. This is what critical race theory is about. And there's something that needs to change about this. So it is going mainstream. So it's good it's going with that. Aside from my book buying commentary, I just think that the book, if Carl went on Fox News, I think it would crack into the top 100. Because this is just a separate topic on the book buying market. The Fox News viewers are older and more willing to buy books than I think a lot of people on social media. I think they just see the book and then they only buy the book if they can take like a selfie with it, which I don't know if that's been happening with Jeremy Carl's book, but that's something there. But it is something that I think Fox News would have him on to discuss. I think the only reason they might not have him is, this weird tension with Tucker over, him leaving and other things. So you do have, but I still think that this is a mainstream topic, and that's reflected in Elon Musk's tweet. So moving on, now we've got Kingslander. He asks, I've noticed ever since Trump won the primary that in the remaining primaries, his vote share has been trailing Biden in key states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Do you think this is just due to the race being over and the low propensity Republican base not showing up since they don't need to vote, or is it indicative of the problems in November general election? If it is the former, do you think the people who didn't bother to vote in the primary because Trump already won will vote in the general? I think it's mainly just that everyone knows the primary's over and there's not much of encouragement to go out and vote. I mean, Trump isn't really telling people to go out and vote in the primaries because it's just like over. And once it's declared over, I wouldn't read too much into that. And also, Trump's not really telling people to go out and vote as he was prior when the primary is still going on. So I wouldn't read too much into it. And people, yes, the people who didn't bother to vote in the primary will turn out to vote in November. I think there's also less attention being paid to it. There's fewer ads. People may not be aware that there's a primary coming up because unless they're watching TV ads and there's no TV ads about it, and Trump's not telling them to go out and vote, so they're not going to go out and vote. But they're going to be made very clear to go out and vote on November 5th. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. Focus on what the polls are saying, and polls are still looking very good for Trump. I mean, there was one that just came out showing him with a solid lead over Biden and a solid lead over him in the battleground states. Polling is looking very good. You really just have to worry about if he gets a conviction in this hush money case. It looks like his other cases are not going to go to trial this year, so he doesn't really have to worry about that. The two problems he has is abortion and the hush money case, and I think both of these can be overcome, and even if he's convicted in the hush money case and go on to win the election, because Biden has nothing to run on. And going back to the previous topic, this Palestine stuff is going to, I think, undermine some of his youth vote who they may want to go out to vote for him for abortion or something, but then they're like, this guy is supporting war crimes in Gaza, so we're not going to vote for him. He is going to still, if the Gaza war is still going on in November, I think it's going to be extremely difficult for Biden to pull off a victory, because I think Muslims in America are going to make the conscious decision to say, we're not voting for Biden, to send a message. And it will send a message loud and clear that the Democratic Party needs to move in a more hostile stance towards Israel if Biden loses. And I think they would be smart politics for Muslims to do that, especially if they think that there's no substantial difference between Trump and Biden on that issue. That's the way they can make their move. But on that question, I wouldn't worry too much about it. There's other things to worry about, and I always say it's abortion and possible conviction. Those are the types of things you need to worry about. And if there's special elections that come up, and they go really poorly for Republicans, or there's a lot of polling showing that a lot of Republican voters and Trump voters are maybe not turn out because they think their vote's going to get stolen. There are some of those issues you got to worry about. But when it comes to those primary votes, I think they just think it's over, and they're not aware that there's a primary coming up because there's no more ads about it. So false alarm. Don't get too worked up about it. And now we have another K-Max question. I didn't get to this. And he says, this big affirmative action case I read about and want to see you're familiar with, Regents of the University of California versus Bakke. I think I talked about this, and I've talked about it in a couple of podcasts, so I'm familiar with it. The left touted the admission to medical school of black student Patrick Chavis in place of Alan Bakke, the white student. Ted Kennedy, the New York Times, and Nation all praised him. And it turns out, as Dr. Chavis had a large number of patients that he harmed, video recordings of his many major mistakes, a huge number of malpractice lawsuits against him, and eventual loss of his medical license. Is this the George Floyd treatment where the left lauds someone as a saint and gets away with it? Affirmative action should have died right here with the case, should it not? How come the right has a hard time not nailing with cases like Patrick Chavis and how it costs lives? You're familiar with this case? Yeah, I'm somewhat familiar with the case. It is something that just shows what's the harm of affirmative action and how you get incompetent people in there. But I think the right didn't go with it because it's they're even back in the 80s and 90s. I forget when it came out about Chavis. they didn't want to be accused of being racist. And when you highlight a black student and our black doctor like this, is like, this is what you bring with affirmative action. They still get queasy because they're just like, well, that might be a little bit too racist for us to talk about. So we're going to just talk about how Asians are being discriminated against. And this is anti-Asian bias. So they don't really want to focus on how it brings in incompetent blacks and Hispanics into these roles that should be designed for whites. They want to focus on just how it hurts Asians. And you are seeing a little bit of a change with that, not with Chavez, but Rufo and others, I criticize Rufo, but I always say he does good work, is Rufo is highlighting about how all these black academics are committing plagiarism, which is awesome. Because it is just showing how much of a joke it is. And pretty much every black academic they look into is guilty of it, which is just, it shows just how incompetent they are, and they're not succeeding by their own merit. They're just succeeding because of the color of their skin. And I'm sure if they went and investigated some of these affirmative action cases with medical school, they would find similar cases of malpractice. I think that there's been this fear of going into that investigating because of the fear of looking racist, and they don't want to have that happen to them. But I think it would be good to do that type of investigation. So the reason why they don't as go into it, I think one is that they weren't aware that this guy was doing that because there's no one investigating it. New York Times isn't talking about it, so they're just not aware. And even if they were aware, they're queasy about going into that because they don't want to sound too racist by looking at it like, well, here's what happens when you have incompetent blacks take these positions rather than whites. So there's a high cost of affirmative action. It's not just that you lose your job or a competent white loses that job. It's something else happens. Now we're going to move on to liberal farts, college apparatchik. He says Second Amendment defense is obviously a huge important issue on the right, but is gun collecting the gayest hobby on the right today? Gun guys spend thousands of dollars a month on new guns and ammunition, take close quarters battle courses, and discuss the latest war fighting techniques they've seen on YouTube. At the range, they criticize your form for not conforming to operators, and when you go to their house, they show off their gun collection like a lefty shows off his Funko Pops. What gives? Is every right-wing hobby bound to descend into insufferable spurgery, or is this unique to gun culture? I don't think it's unique to gun culture. I think it's just something that, like, collectors are all like this, whether they're collecting Funko Pops or what your sort. I have talked about this with gun, as a lot of gun guys do descend into kind of, it's Gunko Pop collectors with it. It's like they spend an inordinate amount of money on this stuff, and they're never going to use these guns in what they claim to. It's like, this is the best defense against tyranny, but it is just, it's a hobby for them, and there's nothing wrong with having a hobby, but a lot of these guys, it's done to, even though the left goes into this a little bit, there's some truth to this, that a lot of guys who are really into gun collecting or trying to compensate. I don't say this about all. Like, I think there's a lot of great normal gun collectors, and if you're into guns, that's a sign you're right wing and open to our ideas. But the problem is that the gun rights movement is now just obsessed with the guns as an inanimate object, rather than it being an expression of culture of how traditional American culture is that we imagine that to be a full citizen, you had to have the ability to bear arms so you could defend yourself. And that's a part of being a citizen, is that you can provide for yourself and defend for yourself. And it's something that is it connects people to the frontier, and it's very much for a part of our culture. And if you're into guns, it's very right wing, or it used to be. But the gun rights movement has become more cringe because they're like, oh, this is awesome that illegal aliens can have guns. We need everyone to have guns. And that they also think that this magic item will just prevent crime. Is that we need gangbangers to have more guns too, and that they'll not try to shoot each other. It's like almost peak libertarianism, and that a lot of these guys, like, I don't want to condemn anyone's hobbies, but some guys may just want to have a lot of guns because they think it's cool. They like to fire stuff, and it is cool. But I think a lot of these guys, they think that the more guns they have, the more likely the government afraid of them and tyranny. But that's not so much the case. And there was a ton of cases of these guys who had a massive gun collections who were arrested over J6. And I think it was smart that they didn't use it, but all these guys who claim that they have guns is like, oh, my guns prevent tyranny. And then there's these guys who have a whole arsenal and that they're easily arrested, because, which smart. I don't think that they should be using those guns. That it's the smart thing to do. They shouldn't be firing at law enforcement to deal with their case in court. But, it undermines this notion that, the government really fears an armed population. I always go back to this example. I think it was Texas, where was this case. I may be corrected, but there was this bar that was staying open during lockdowns, and they brought out these militia guys with AR-15s, or wannabe militia. I don't know who these guys were. And police showed up and just pointed their handguns at them, and then all these guys surrendered. And, maybe guns aren't the best. And this really just goes off against the Civil War fantasies of these guys that like, well, the more guns I have, the government's going to be really afraid of me. But if police officers just go out there and they see these guys are otherwise law-abiding citizens, they don't really have the capacity for violence like cartel gunmen or gangbangers have. And, if they point a gun at them and says, put up your hands, these guys are law-abiding citizens. They're going to follow along. And that just shows that, if you did have that type of situation where, people were required to fight against the government, a lot of them would just surrender because it's like, oh, it's the army telling me to come out, or it's the police officers telling me to come out. A lot of right-wingers, even if they're on Twitter saying that they hate cops and they hate authority, they're instinctually motivated, or they have an instinctual bias to follow authority and order. A lot of conservatives are like this. This is even when you get right-wingers on jury trials, and they'll still vote with the rest of the jury, even if it's against a right winger or a conservative. This could have even been seen in the case with Douglas Mackey, Ricky Vaughn, who there was possibly other conservatives on there who would have maybe seen this as an abuse of justice, but they felt like, well, all these authority figures are telling me he's guilty, and I don't want to disagree with the foreman, so I'm going to vote for a guilty verdict. So that's like kind of a separate issue from gun rights as a hobby, but a lot of the gun rights movement has just become cringe due to more of their positions of like wanting everyone to have guns, whether it's like the illegal aliens having guns, like we need that, and so they can fight against ICE and Border Patrol. And it's like, no. I favor ICE and Border Patrol here. I don't want illegal aliens shooting at ICE. Why do I want that? And you see all these libertarians is like, oh, if everyone has a gun, then we'll have a more peaceful society, which is, I don't really think that's the case. If you have law-abiding citizens with guns and, they want to protect their property, criminals will know not to break into their home and stuff. Now, that's a signal. But when it comes to, people who are already committing crimes having guns, you don't want that. And so all these people now, they argue for violent felons getting their gun rights back and other things. I think there are legitimate gun restrictions like keeping illegal immigrants from having guns, violent felons from owning firearms. I support this. I don't view that there should be a universal Second Amendment right for everyone. It should just be for those who are law-abiding citizens. Now, I do worry about red flag laws and other things because that can be used against political dissidents. That's the one thing that I have a problem with. But violent felons and illegal immigrants are not political dissidents. They should not own firearms. And so that's a problem with the gun rights movement. But as gun owners themselves, yeah, there is a vocal minority among them who are very cringe. And they, rather than wanting to defend a culture or people with these guns and it's being an expression of that culture and people, the inanimate object becomes the whole focus. And you owning this inanimate object makes you part of their team, which that's not the case. It's like you only want law-abiding middle Americans, historic American nation, owning the firearm and to defend themselves against criminals and bad actors. But a lot of these guys, they just view this as their own little toy. And if you own a toy, even if you're a legal immigrant and a gangbanger, you're on the same team as them, which that's not the case. So I have to conclude, I support the Second Amendment, generally against most gun restrictions, except when it comes to disenfranchising the right for people you don't want to have guns having guns. But I do think the gun rights movement has become much more cringe because it's been affected by a lot of libertarianism, and that they, like every other conservative element, wants to have more minorities there. So soy jack at the thought of blacks owning firearms and Hispanics owning firearms and criminals owning firearms, and they think that more people owning guns is better, which you should only want particular law-abiding citizens to own guns. And a lot of these guys, by buying up all these firearms, are buying into a fantasy that they alone can resist government tyranny, and they can't. And it's more that it's like a collection of toys rather than collecting an arsenal to defend their own liberty. Now, there's nothing wrong with having a gun collection. It's pretty cool if you like to go off and fire a lot of these guns. That's pretty awesome. Not criticizing that, but I think people need to be realistic and understand that, no matter how many guns you have, if you're not organized, if you don't have any connections to the levers of power or anything else that can defend you, you are out alone, and the government can easily take away your liberty and your guns, as seen with a lot of these J6ers. So that's my point on that. I will explore this more. I did write an article last year about this matter with the Funko Pop, the Gunko Pop, and these gun rights guys. So next question comes from John Chandler. He asked, curious if you could talk about the VDARE conference. Enjoyed watching your speech, and if you could talk about the latest news regarding that organization, if any update. Also curious to hear what the Berkeley Castle is like. No, it was a great conference. I gave a talk. Good people there. Solid crowd. I should be posting my speech either the draft that I based it off of. I went off the cuff. I didn't really look down to my speech. I just have it as an outline. I think it would be better if I just had bullet points and stuff and just had it there. I don't give it as many speeches, but generally what I do, and I did this last year, is I have a whole speech written out, and then I look at it, and then I just, I start off with maybe the opening paragraph, and then I go and make my own points. So I'm looking at the crowd and not looking at my paper. It's almost like giving a podcast live. So it was a good time. I don't really have any latest news regarding VDARE. I think they're shutting down, but they're keeping the castle and they're going to start doing events there. But I'm not 100% certain what's happening. So I'm not the best person to ask. But it was a great conference. So I should have that stuff up, my speech up as the first column for the week tomorrow. And so hopefully you guys enjoy that. And the Berkeley Castle is awesome. Great location. It's, they've even got a knight, one of those knight's armor, mannequins type up there when you enter the castle. It's a cool place. So all positive things around to say about it. It's a great conference. Speech seemed to be well received by the crowd. So only good things to say about the VDARE. Fortunately, don't have a lot to say about updates on the organization because it's a very complicated matter and I don't 100% fully understand it or what's happening next. But I do think VDARE is shutting down the website, but then they're going to turn into a new group of some sort. So I should give an update when that's all settled and there's something new to report on that. So we're going to end this podcast. Everything else, if I should have replied to you, it's going to be for the mailbag. So this is the final question for today. And this is from New England Refugee. Where do you go to get far leftist takes when you want to see what they think? Twitter accounts or websites like Jacobin or New Republic? To me, the far left seems depressed about everything right now. Thanks. Both Twitter and going to websites like that, like Slate and other things. I follow them on Twitter, so generally you see a lot of that. Sometimes go to the New York Times because New York Times does a lot of what's the left thinking about this articles. So that's generally how I find out takes. There's some really far left takes you find. Probably actually the best way to understand what the far left thinks is to follow Chapo, the Chapo host. But unfortunately, they mainly tweet about movies now. And I'm not going to listen to the podcast, but they're a good barometer for how the far left thinks. And so if I had to recommend Twitter accounts, I'd probably recommend them. I don't follow a whole lot because a lot of them block me. I follow Sean McCarthy, but Sean McCarthy's not the best barometer of how the far left thinks, but I do follow him. and a few others. Jacobin's not even probably the best barometer of this. New Republic is pretty good because I get a lot of their updates, and they're trying to be more resistance than I think like Chapo, but they're still will be critical of Israel in a way that a lot of the other resistance liberals won't be. So you can see those opinions, but I feel like I have a, and you can then just watch the news and see what they're protesting about as well to find out what they care about, as seen with the Palestine stuff, which the far left is riling up. These protests are riling up and disorienting the entire left at the moment. So that's something you can learn from them. So that's, I guess, where I get my news on what's the left up to. So that is it for this Highly Respected today. Hopefully you guys all enjoyed it. We're going to have a great column tomorrow. It should be my VDare speech of some sort. I think they told me they may have the transcript of the speech up. I think they're going to be posting this onto VDare, but if they do post it onto VDare, I'd have to talk with them. So if they get the actual speech I gave and the transcript of it, I'd probably post that onto my Substack and also have the link to VDare. And also there should be a video along with it, so I'll have that on the Substack. And we'll see. So we'll have something VDare related, conference related tomorrow. Then we're gonna have the mailbag Wednesday, then a great column on Thursday, and then the IQ supplement on Friday. So we're gonna have a jam-packed week of content. So be on the lookout for that. So until next time, stay respected.